Welcome to the Neural Implant Podcast, where we talk with the people behind the current events and breakthroughs in brain implants in an understandable way, helping bring together various fields involved in neuroprosthetics. Here is your host, Laden Yuracek.
I think we can start.
Sure.
It's Dr. Elhilali, and you just did a keynote speech at NER here, Baltimore, 2023, talking about auditory processing and selectivity in auditory processing, basically focus and attention, and how those things can be affected. And you brought this into a pilot error, a plane crash, that there was some beeping, but that beeping caused another error to be overlooked or something like that. This has big implications. Yeah, do you want to describe your work a little bit?
Yeah, we're interested in basically understanding how the brain or the auditory system specifically understands or processes sounds in everyday life, basically complex sounds when you were listening to multiple sounds that, having a conversation with a friend or walking down a street. And so there are different elements that go into this process. Part of it is basically understanding the mapping of those signals inside the brain. Part of it is understanding how different parts of the brain come into play to help us make sense of these sounds. As I said, for example, when we're listening to speech, we rely on the fact that we know language, and that helps us parse through. If we're listening to music, if we happen to be familiar with it, we are processing it slightly differently. And even if we're not familiar with that sound class, there are basic principles that the brain relies on for us to understand sound, though it has built-in the biology sort of relies on certain laws of physics. We understand that sound emanates from a particular production system when we talk, so we'd expect certain dynamics, certain patterns, certain frequencies. And so the work that I do is, on the one hand, trying to understand this representation in the brain, how the brain actually processes sound, what we call the cocktail party problem. How does the brain solve the cocktail party problem? When we walk in a cocktail party, multiple sounds come into our ears. How do we separate them? How do we selectively pay attention to some of them and ignore others? And then that has implications to a number of engineering applications. There is developing better technologies to assist our hearing. There is also other aspects that I didn't mention today. For example, using sound for other aspects of life, like for example, for medical diagnostics. So using a stethoscope is basically a device that allows a physician to listen to sounds from our body. How does the physician hear that sound and infer that this person has pneumonia, for example? So that kind of process and how you use sound to infer information about the world is something that we're interested in.
Yeah, it was really interesting. And then you showed a lot of data saying that basically the attention, whether they're focusing on it or not,
Right.
and then also if it's in a language that they understand, or what you were saying about the cocktail party, if somebody suddenly says your name, then that becomes your attention. Do you want to talk about this a little bit?
Sure,
How does that work?
Yes, we know that our brain has limited processing capacity, so we cannot process all information at once. And one of the tools we do that is to use attention, basically a feedback control process that allows us to sample through what comes into our ear and choose what we want to listen to and what we want to ignore. So oftentimes that kind of sampling process, or what we call selective attention, is referred to as top-down attention. It's something we choose to do based on the goals for us at that moment in time. But at the same time, that interplays against what we refer to as bottom-up attention, basically sounds around us that will grab our attention. Sirens, alarms are all examples of sounds that would grab our attention, and they are designed that way because of their capability to attract our attention. And so that sort of counters I'm trying to ignore the loud construction workers down the street, but they are distracting me because they're constantly grabbing my attention. And so that sort of interplay between what we choose to pay attention to, how we use our neural processes to enhance those signals we want to pay attention to, but at the same time, there are other sounds that may be grabbing our attention. Is that dynamic and push-pull is something that we are interested in understanding, because it helps us understand how we use our neural resources to process complex sounds.
So I heard when you're talking about the construction that the beeping when they're backing up, that's going to be changed by like a white noise, like a Do you have any data on that? Is that better or worse? And is that something you were also saying that eventually people tune that out? And then in a conversation you had with somebody after the talk, you were saying nurses are especially prone to this. There's so much beeping and they just ignore everything. So how does all that work?
So the way sounds become distracting to us in many ways is because they don't fit with the current state of the world as our brain understands it. So right now I'm talking to you. So each of us have an understanding of the world around us, which is our two voices and probably some random background because we know people are walking, some footsteps, maybe some chatter. But things that won't fit within those expectations, that world model that our brain has built, is going to stand out to us. A phone starts ringing right now. We're not expecting that unless we're expecting it. But even that would stand out to us, and our brain would automatically, because of that violation of our world model that we have built in, and that's a world model that evolves on a moment-by-moment basis. So that when that stands out, then that sort of grabs our attention. And then over time, if that were to happen constantly, if you work in a call-in center, you don't react to a phone ring the same way as if it just happens occasionally. Even the same phone ring, when it rings the first time, the second, the third, your reaction to the third ring is not the same as your reaction to the first ring because you have adapted your world model. And so that adaptation process is something that is challenging for professions where alarms are important. So I mentioned the nurses that rely on certain types of beeps and alarms to alert them to something happening that requires their attention. And it's an ongoing conversation or topic of research of how do you make these alarms effective but not really being tuned out. Over time by training, nurses, for example, learn to interpret different alarms differently, but they don't react to them in the same sort of alarmed panic mode that you would do that if you were in that room and you hear the beep. They don't react because they have adapted their mental image of the world or model of the world has incorporated those as part of a normal state of things.
Would the answer be to just make it progressively more and more scary until it's sounds like a T-Rex about to eat you or something like this? Or?
Not necessarily. So in those settings, I think this is not an area I work on directly, but I know from some studies that those don't necessarily work effectively. So for purposes of just alerting, say a nurse, for example, those don't work because over time, those would still be adapted to. But there's also details, like you mentioned, white noise. Is it better to have a high-pitched, a low-pitched, like a very narrow band sound versus a broadband sound? And those would have different effectiveness. I don't know that there is an answer that fits to all possible settings where that would work, but this is something that, as we understand better this mental model that our brain constantly builds about the world around us, maybe we can tailor different alarm signals, if that is the focus really or interest, to those. The example I mentioned about the aviation accident is something where even though the alarm was there, but then there's also the counter side of that, which is where the operator's focus was. And it was to such an extent in an alarmed state, focusing on X, that they were not able to process Y. So even though the alarm was there, and by all measures, that alarm Y should have attracted their attention, but it didn't in that moment in time. And depending on the setting and the industries, the solution is to have two people in the room. That's one solution. But those are things that, maybe as we understand better how to manage and process multiple elements of the sound, we can try to tailor it to the setting where we are and maybe not have one alarm set at all times, the same one.
Or maybe have nurses take sabbaticals to resensitize.
To resensitize, yes. Yes.
So in the talk, you had mentioned you do your studies with EEG caps in human subjects, but then I think you mentioned something about mammalian subjects. So what do you do? How do you do
the work that I do is primarily with human subjects with scalp EEG. I do through collaborations work with other colleagues who work with various animal models, for example. So some of the data I showed was when I was a sort of a graduate student. We've worked with ferrets. I continue to collaborate with colleagues who work with ferrets, colleagues who work with bats, with monkeys. These different animal models provide different access to the system in different ways. For example, we had a project on sonar. So bats are an animal model that is a mammal but relies on sort of active echolocation to send the sound and rely on the feedback to navigate. And so that sort of provides a different aspect rather than passive acoustics, which is what humans rely on, which is just sound coming in, but we're not really actively engaging the world around us, they provide different insights into how the auditory system functions and interacts with the sounds based on complexity, but based on goals and what you're trying to achieve and what you're trying to detect.
And why ferrets? I've never heard of this as an animal model.
Oh, ferrets. Ferrets is an animal model that works because the auditory cortex is relatively exposed and easier to access, but there is no other major reason that you wouldn't choose a different. It is a fairly sophisticated animal, but its auditory cortex is fairly accessible, so to speak.
Okay.
So in terms of recordings.
And then I had a question after your talk. It was a lot of the audio that you were playing was kind of like overlaid, like some kind of alarm plus something else. And I commented that it sounds very much sleeping through an alarm or something like that, and integrating that into a dream, and talking about awake state versus semi-awake state.
Right.
You mentioned comatose as well.
Yes.
Did you want to talk about this as well?
Yeah, so it's not a specific area I work on, but through work, I guess, in the field, we know that some of the basic properties or principles that we observe exists whether the person is actively engaged or even conscious or not, but the activation of the cognitive system sometimes amplifies, sometimes modulates what the basic properties of the sensory signals are. It's the same thing as studying, let's say, in animal models under anesthesia. You see some basic responses, but they are different than when you engage let's say, an animal in an awake state, and then when they are awake and actually behaving and engaging with the system. It's basically, think of it as different tiers of how these different networks interact and operate with each other. And in a way, I think it's a complex enough system that it's really a convergence of different studies, different models, different techniques that allows us to shed some light on how these interactions are operating.
Yeah, I think that could be, very much shed light on it and learn how it goes. Let's talk about you. How did you get into this, and what's your story and all this kind of stuff?
I guess my basic educational path is in engineering primarily. I did an undergraduate in computer science. I joined the graduate program at the University of Maryland because I was always interested in neuroscience broadly. And so I joined a specific lab that studies basically the auditory system. That's where the work with the ferrets came to be. But it addressed the problem from what I felt was an engineering problem. So I mentioned this black box idea. You think of it as a black box, you understand what goes in, you understand what goes out, and you're trying to understand what went in the middle. And I've always just been fascinated by neuroscience, just trying to understand how intelligence really emerges through basic communication of simple components. And it happens to be that it's a lab that was focused on the auditory world, I am musically trained, so it's something that interests me as well. And so that's how I sort of got into the world of neuroscience, but really through an engineering perspective. Right now, I continue to be, I guess, a professor in electrical and computer engineering, but I do have an affiliation with psychology and brain sciences because I very much appreciate having this sort of multidisciplinary understanding of both perspectives, the complexities of a basic neuroscience kind of experiment and questions, but also trying to address them as an engineer and occasionally pose the question, so what is the impact of what I'm learning? So there is the scientific knowledge in understanding better the complexities of the brain, and then there is is there translational impact, what we're learning, developing specific tools and specific, sometimes technology.
So podcast is probably your preferred medium.
I am the sound person, so yes.
So
yes.
Do you consult with people, or are you creating products or something like this? You're talking about translation, turning? Yeah,
so depending, I guess, on different questions. So I've mentioned, for example, stethoscope. So this is an area that a part of my lab works on, is using sound for medical diagnostics. I want to say, 10 years ago, we started this collaboration with the School of Medicine and Public Health at Johns Hopkins. The idea there was that there are a number of pulmonary diseases, particularly pneumonia, that is the number one killer of children worldwide. And particularly in low-resource countries, it is really a treatable disease, but in many settings, you just don't have the tools to diagnose it to be able to treat it. And sound is such a cheap medium. It doesn't require fancy equipment, and x-rays, even x-rays nowadays are not as expensive, but you don't require really any fancy imaging tools to do. And if we can interpret sounds, we may not quite bypass the medical expertise, but we can make the processing faster. And so that started this whole project. Is we know what to do with sound, we know how to analyze sound. So what the colleagues in the medical school said, can we give you some sounds we recorded in a number of clinics around the world, and are you able to process them and tell us what is happening? So that opened the door to challenges. So these are sounds. So these would be field workers in clinic in Malawi recording the lungs of children. But these are not done in a nice, quiet doctor's office. These are done in a very open setting where you can hear cars, cows, all kinds of things. And you're trying to selectively attend to the lung and hear the breathing. And so that sort of opened the door to a lot of trying to use what we learned from how the brain sieves through information to develop algorithms to do the same thing. And so right now there is an actual product on the market that I'm not involved with that led to a patent. There is now a company that has licensed and is developing these kinds of products, basically using AI to interpret and process sounds. And the goal is to make it cheap and accessible so that you can have a device that you put on your lung and it flags when something abnormal is happening, just like a physician would listen to it and be able to hear that. So that's a kind of an example where you can use a lot of these principles from neuroscience because they give you really a way of how to deal with complexities of sounds. In this particular application, it happens to be that we have collaborations with other colleagues working, we've been working, I've mentioned sonar and working on biosonar. So there's a variety of domains and directions where this works manifests itself and can translate and evolve into an actual technology, all while trying to just understand really how the complexities of the brain actually.
Yeah, that's amazing. That's really cool. And especially I feel a little bit bad for our listeners because they're hearing all sorts of vacuuming and carts going around and everything like that. But I do find that recordings are sometimes harder to ignore the sounds rather than real life. Like originally I wanted to record over on the other side of the conference center, but there's running water. And when we're talking, when we're there, we might not even notice. But in the recording, it would just be, you couldn't ignore that. Is that just because we have two ears or something?
Because it is definitely a component of it. If you have really a fancy recording setup, you can then build in the signal processing to deal with that. But if your brain is there, then it has a signal processing capability to deal with that. If you're using a simple microphone, then it then loses the spatial layout potentially, and then becomes more challenging for your brain on the receiver end to then do the signal processing to undo the process. So your brain on the spot will ignore that running water because it has the right tools to do that filtering operation on the gut. And so if you come in the middle and mess with the setup, then your listener now has to try to undo this process and then filter it out. And so that's part of the challenge.
Yeah, okay. Cool. I hope we have even better noise canceling and even somebody's yelling at us. We might not even hear it. Is there anything that we didn't talk about that you wanted to mention?
No, I think that it was a great discussion. Thank you for taking the time. Appreciate it.
Thanks. You too.
Hope you enjoyed the show and were able to learn something new, bringing together different fields in novel ways. Until next time on the Neural Implant Podcast.